Imitation. That is the thing that I will often say when people ask me, what's different about IEW writing program? And imitation is something we don't think about a lot consciously, but I want to make an argument as well as give you a pathway for using imitation to teach writing. So this talk, from copywork to composition, is going to be kind of a broad view of the value of imitation, a little bit of apologetic as to why we need to even talk about the importance of it in some perspective, as well as some very practical things you could do tomorrow morning, if you, or tonight, I suppose, if you wanted to teach writing better or improve your own writing. So, here are two kind of opposing views. Ironically, the newer, more kind of progressive view would be represented perhaps in this statement: envy is ignorance, imitation is suicide. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Whereas the kind of older, more traditional, even classical view would be articulated by someone now still alive, one of my favorite guys, Mike Rowe. Innovation without imitation is a complete waste of time. So we see there the two attitudes, if you will. And one of the things, if you were to kind of look at the history of education, we've had swings, right, between extremes. And there's been times when we went so far to one side, we lost the benefits of the other. And other times when we went so far in the opposite direction, we lost some of the benefits. So I think a balanced approach is good, and we certainly don't want to throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater, which I find to be a very weird expression, but we still use it, I guess. Wasn't it that theory that, you know, you'd put the oldest person in the bath first, and then you'd wash everybody in the family, and then the baby was last, and then it was already so dirty you would lose the baby in the dirty bathwater? That's what I heard. I don't think there's any truth to it, but. So let us think about skills. Writing is a skill. Skills are things that you have to do in order to learn them, as opposed to information, which you could memorize, concepts that you could develop through discussion. Skills are those things that you have to actually do them with your body in order to learn. Things like dance, drawing, painting, playing a musical instrument, playing a sport, right? Writing would fall in this category. You can't really learn it if you don't do it. And so when we look at skills development, we would discover that imitation is a natural human faculty by which we pretty much learn everything. Most of you have had opportunity to live with young children. And it's very exciting to observe children because they start to acquire all sorts of skills. And as they get a little bit older, you notice that they sometimes will acquire habits or patterns of speech or behavior or even movement that are kind of specific to their family. One of the things that Dr. Suzuki noted long time ago was that all Japanese children learn Japanese pretty much effortlessly, which no one else in the world can do. Why? Because they have the right environment, they start at a very young age, and there's this feedback loop, and it's pretty much all through imitation by which we learn our mother tongue. So it's a natural human faculty. If we want to improve in something, we need a model. We need something that is better than us. So when you think about it, let's say you want to improve your ability to do something, whether it's playing golf or painting or drawing or singing, right? If you just do what you can do, well, you will be able to do what you can do, and you will continue to be able to do what you can do, but you will only be able to do what you can do because you're only doing what you can do. Follow that? If you want to improve, what do you need? A coach, someone who can demonstrate a superior way to do that, a model to imitate. And so if we want to improve in a skill, we need to continue this path of imitation. We see in the modern world progressive ideas that have, in a way, kind of downplayed the importance of imitation. We saw in the Emerson quote there. And it's kind of happened. I mean, short history, if you want to, of education. At a certain time in the last century, there began a process of essentially removing God from public education specifically, and that created a vacuum. So now you need a new God. And so the new God of education, which kind of rose up, I would guess, in the 60s, 70s when I was young, still strong in the 80s, 90s, was creativity, right? So creativity is all important. If it's creative, it's good. And if it's not creative, it's not good. And how dare you tell someone exactly how to do something, because that would stifle their originality and creativity. Now, there's maybe some truth to that, but taken to an extreme, what happens? Decline of basic skills. And so that happened for a long time, and then it didn't really work. This whole huge emphasis on creativity being the driver of education didn't get the kind of results. So then they kind of removed that and came in with a new God. And the new God of education became standards. And if you remember, the No Child Left Behind, the Race to the Top, the Common Core State Standard Initiative, these things were all trying to say, okay, the solution here is if we would all just work toward these standards, then we would accomplish our goals of education, of preparing children for, life. Well, that didn't work either, because we've had so many iterations of these standards. And, basically it kind of goes like this. They set a standard, and then people fail to meet the standard, so they lower the standard. People still fail to meet the standard, so they lower the standard. People still fail to meet the standard, so they lower it, and then someone comes along and says, these standards are very low. We need to raise them. So we've been through several kind of cycles like this, and that just hasn't worked. So now we've kind of got rid of that and replaced it with the new God of education, which is, of course, technology, right? If we have more technology in the classrooms, then children will learn better. Well, this is kind of proving to not be true. And of course, there's a place for standards and expectations. There's a place for the judicious use of technology. But in a way, we've got so far away from where we were when most people graduating from high school could read and write and do math decently well. So I would argue that by looking backward, we can see that imitation was a profoundly effective way of teaching language skills, and we've kind of lost that with this wave of progressivism. The foundation of creativity is basic skills, right? You can just say, okay, if you want to learn to play the piano, and I'm a piano teacher, I could do it two ways. I could say, okay, come on over to my place, and I'll teach you how to sit on the bench, and I'll show you how to push the keys with your fingers, and I'll even show you how to use these cool little pedals here. But there is one little rule. You can't play something that anyone else ever played. You have to kind of make up and be unique and be original and be creative, and that's how you'll learn to play the piano. And just go home and do that for half an hour a day for the next 5 years. Well, what would happen? Would you learn to play the piano? Yes. Would you learn to play the piano well? Probably not. What do we do? And my background, of course, is in music education, so I always look at it through that filter. Well, we basically say, play this piece in this way, imitate me precisely, and play this next piece this way, and imitate me precisely. And we do that for quite a period of time, years. And then on that foundation of basic skills, we can begin to talk about the creative elements: interpretation, improvisation, composition. Language is the same way. So we can look and see kind of a history of the power of what we might call copywork. Now, I find it odd, but this word copywork, if you type it into Microsoft Word, it comes up as a red underline. It's not yet in the dictionary. So you'd have to have copy and work as two words, otherwise your computer wouldn't like it. But it really is one concept, and that is you do work by copying. It's copywork, and it's not limited to handwriting. We think of it maybe in that way. One of the interesting things is that great painters have had students who imitated their great paintings. There are many knockoffs of the Mona Lisa. Why? Because Da Vinci's students and other people who weren't necessarily direct students would look at that and say, well, that's a masterpiece. If I want to improve, I could do so by imitating that. I happened to be in a museum in Europe that had a Rembrandt room, and it was wonderful. I got to see the actual Prodigal Son painting of Rembrandt. Is a high moment in my viewing of art life. But what I found so interesting was in this Rembrandt room were the Rembrandts that the museum possessed. There was also a whole wall of knockoffs of Rembrandt. People who had, throughout time, since Rembrandt lived up even to the present day, practiced their skill by imitating the master. We see this in another one. Alan Greenberg, who is one of the kind of neoclassicists in architecture, tells the story of when he went to architecture school, spent the whole first year doing nothing but copying the drawings of about, I don't know if it was exactly, but the 100 or so greatest buildings, the greatest structures of all time. Why? Well, by copying, what happens is you start to internalize all of that information in a very a very non-specific but powerful sensory way. There's the story of Bach. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but Bach lived with an older brother, and in his day, there was no printing of music widely available. Almost all music was handwritten, and therefore it was very expensive. And so Bach, as a child, would, in the middle of the night, sneak down. He knew where the secret key was to the cabinet where all of the very valuable locked music was stored. He would take out some of this music, and by candlelight or moonlight, he would copy the music so that he could have his own copies. And in doing that, what happens? Well, he would internalize a huge amount of information about music, and that became a foundation upon which his creative brilliance was possible. So there are more stories, but this idea of copywork in the arts, very powerful. Now, some of you are intersecting or touching to some degree the world of classical education. And if you are, you may have heard of this idea of the 5 canons of rhetoric. This is not the big gun canon. That's got 3 N's. This is the 2N canon, which means collection of or division. We most often hear the term canon in, say, the canon of scripture or the canon of Western literature, meaning the collection of those things. But this term, the 5 canons of classical rhetoric, were the 5 things that you would study and practice in order to become skilled in the art of speaking well. So the first thing that we usually think of is invention. So if you want to give a speech, you got to have something to say, right? And so you would have to think of, what do you want to say? This, by the way, is where a lot of kids get stuck. You've probably all experienced the problem of a child who has to write a story or write a composition or something, and they don't know what to do. And you say, well, what's wrong? I don't know what to say. I don't know what to write. I can't think of anything. Of course, they think of things all the time. There's a skill, though, of being able to find out what you're actually thinking. And that word invention is from the Latin verb invenio, meaning to find or discover. So in writing, in the classical rhetoric sense, we don't just create something from nothing. We find ideas that are already there. And so this is a very freeing idea. And this is usually first because if you were to think about, okay, you got to write a speech, first thing, what are you going to say? Then you would say, how am I going to organize that? What sequence of ideas? They call this arrangement. So how are we going to structure this speech or this piece of writing? What would be best to say first? What would be best to say next? What would be best to say that? And there's strategy to this too. As we know, the art of rhetoric is often called the art of persuasion, and there are certain ways to persuade people by sequencing ideas so that you draw them in rather than confront or alienate or cause them to just stop listening or caring about what you're saying. So that's part of that strategy. The next thing would be how to say it. We call this elocution. This is from the Latin verb loquor, meaning to speak, right? And so how are you going to say what you're going to say? Both the words you use, the grammatical structures that you use, and then the literary or poetic devices that you would use. Then, in the old days, before there was the ability to make copies cheaply, memory. Why? Because if you wanted to promulgate an idea 2,000 years ago, you really wouldn't have been very effective to handwrite out 1,000 copies of whatever and try to give it away. What you would do is you would write it out, you would then memorize it, you would commit it to your memory by heart, and then you would go around town and talk to 100 or more people at a time, and that's how you would promulgate ideas. I think we would find it very odd if we went to the supermarket and someone was standing out in front giving a speech. That would be a little bit of an anomaly in our modern world. But the principle still stands that when you're communicating, if you know what you're saying, it's more effective than if you are constantly referring to notes or reading or whatever. So cultivation of memory. And then lastly would be delivery. And that was in ancient times very specific to public speaking. So if you were to take a class in public speaking, you'd talk about projecting your voice and making eye contact and using emotional expressions to increase the impact of your message. So these are the 5 canons of rhetoric, and we tend to think of memory as the technique, right? And from ancient times through medieval times, there were techniques that people studied and practiced in order to be able to memorize long chunks of things. And people still do that today. You may not know, but there's national and international memory competitions where people will see how quickly can you memorize 3 decks of mixed up cards. Things that you or I would think impossible, but they are possible. However, there's another aspect of memory that kind of precedes all that, and that would be the furnishing of the mind. Just to use that expression, furnishing the mind is when you are able to store in your mind vocabulary, syntax, grammatical patterns, literary devices and usage, quotations from other people that are particularly eloquent. Do you ever notice when someone quotes someone who's supposedly well-known, famous, or excellent in some way? It just gives you credibility. In fact, you could design a whole speech just quoting other people, and you'd sound way smarter than you actually are. Well, at least I would, right? So the 5 canons of rhetoric, thinking about furnishing the mind as part of the imitation process. Now, we're going to look at writing, and you would say, okay, if someone says, write something, what do you have to do in order to accomplish that? And you think about young children, and somebody says to them, write something, right? And so what's the first thing that has to happen? Well, I mentioned First thing that you have to have is an idea. The idea must pre-exist. If there is no idea, there is nothing to write. You're dead in the water, and you might as well just go swimming. I don't know if that works or not. All right, so you have to have an idea, and usually ideas are in sequence, right? So there's things that happened, or there's logical processes, or there's lists of things, right? But you have to have the idea, and that's, like I said, where a lot of kids kind of are stuck in the beginning. So you got to have the idea. Now, an idea can pre-exist in the mind through memory or imagination, or it can pre-exist outside the mind. Let me give you an example. If I said to you, please write about the ceiling in this room, right? You probably haven't thought much about the ceiling in this room, but now you can look up at it and you apprehend it, and then you can notice things about this room, and you could probably communicate some of those things to some degree. So the idea of the ceiling in this room would pre-exist outside your mind. Or I could say, write about the last trip you took with someone in your family, right? That would pre-exist in your memory and imagination to some degree. If I said, write about aliens on the planet Zug, that would only exist in your imagination, and some people would not have anything really connected with that, and then you'd have to go find other things about space aliens and planets and pull together some memory of science fiction that you saw or read or something, right? So the ideas can pre-exist outside the mind or pre-exist inside the memory and imagination, but it must pre-exist. The second thing is that ideas can pre-exist primarily in words, or they can exist primarily in images or sensory impressions. Give you another example. If I said to you, write about a conversation you had with a family member, spouse, child, whatever, you could probably come up with something, or maybe I would say, write about something you read recently, right? Those ideas would pre-exist in words. If I said, write about your favorite place to go on a vacation, well, that pretty much pre-exists in sensory impressions. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you feel? What did you do? What did you taste or smell, right? And so you'd have to have access to that. Now, one of the things we've noticed is that for children, it is easier for them to apprehend something immediately than to access memory. It's kind of counterintuitive, right? It's also easier for children to reconstruct into words something that pre-existed in words. So when we start teaching writing with our system, as I'm going to show you here shortly, we start with ideas that generally pre-exist outside the mind but are immediately available in words. But regardless of where you start, that's prerequisite. All right, then the writer must kind of speak those words into existence. So you have an idea. Maybe it came from words, maybe it didn't, maybe it's a sensory thing, but you have to now speak that idea into existence in order to make it concrete. So I noticed this, like if you ask children, what do you want to write about? And they say, oh, my dog, my pet, right? They love to write about their dog and pet, but then when they start, they don't know what to write because dogs don't talk. Your experience of a dog is visceral, emotional, kinesthetic. It's a nonverbal experience interacting with the dog. So you have to find the words to speak that into existence. Whereas if I said, tell me about this Aesop fable that we just read, well, that's going to be easier. But either way, they have to speak it into existence. Then they have to hear what they just said. And I'm sure you've spent enough time with children to notice that they can speak without hearing what they just said, right? So it takes an act of will to listen to yourself. Now, it's easier to hear what you said if you said it out loud. If you just thought it silently into words, it's a little harder to hear it. But either way, you've got to hear what you just thought. Then you have to hold that in your memory. So you get an idea, you speak it into existence, you hear what you heard yourself think, you hold that in your memory long enough to then go and get the information you need to write that word, which would, for the most part, involve making letters and spelling words. Then you have to go back to your memory and think of the next word in the sequence of what you spoke into existence. Go get the information to write that one. Go back to your memory, get the third one, and do that, right? And not forget what you were writing. And we've all had that happen, right? We lose our, what we call train of thought, right? And then we have to do what? Go all the way back to the beginning, apprehend the idea, re-speak it into existence, hold it in our memory, and pick up from where we left off. In fact, when I think about how insanely complex this is, it's almost like an argument for the proof of the existence of God, because it couldn't possibly have evolved. It's way too complicated, but more importantly, it's interesting because it helps us understand why young children, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, have such a hard time. Anytime you meet a child who does not like writing, how many of you have met a child who does not like writing? Okay, yeah, almost always. The reason is they are overwhelmed with the complexity of the process. Doing all that at once is not yet a skill they have acquired. So what do we have to do? We have to break it into steps and help them do that so that they can experience success. And then as they experience success, they dislike writing less and less and less. There's no guarantee that anyone's going to like it. That's not necessarily the goal, but it will become easier and competency should grow. And then you have to not only remember the one idea, you have to remember the next idea. Speak it into existence, hear what you thought, hold it in your memory, wrangle the technical information to record it, and do that in a whole long sequence of ideas. And that can be kind of exhausting, right? Overwhelming and exhausting. So part of our whole approach is to make things less overwhelming and less exhausting. And we use the method of imitation to start that process and develop basic skills. Then there's one last kind of nasty little thing you have to do. Read what you wrote and be sure that's what you wanted to say. And I'm sure all of us have had that experience of writing something and then reading it and thinking, that doesn't quite cut it. That doesn't quite do what I was hoping. Or we flat out just leave words out or use a bad word, and then we got to wrestle that thing to get closer to what our ideal for the idea was. This is a point where children are generally pretty weak because they want to just write it and be done with it and go outside and make farts, which is the real purpose of life when you're 8 years old. But so there's that. You have to check and see. So very complex. And then you got to just keep doing it pretty much for the rest of your life. So I think that's very helpful to understand the complexity of the whole process. Now, how do we help students begin with learning writing through imitation? Well, the first one was we want to build the vocabulary, build the syntax, build that repertoire of use of language that allows for eloquence and ease. This is why I still think that memorized language through poetry and other things, scripture, if you're so inclined, memorized prayers, excerpts from famous speeches, really anything that is beautiful will help to furnish the mind in that way. So we want to practice this as a foundation for everything that comes later. But it's a form of imitation. If I teach you a poem and you memorize it, now you can recite it to me or you can teach it to someone else, we've passed that poem on through the faculty of imitation. The next thing that we would do is just teach basic how to make letters and spell words. This is where we have our primary arts of language program. And in this program, we suggest simple copywork. Now, what is that? Well, here's a sentence, copy it. All right? Here's words, copy them. It used to be that children would do a lot of copying. In fact, if you were to go back and look at, say, the curriculum up through grade 2 or 3, 150 years ago, it was all copywork. Nobody would have wasted paper on an 8-year-old so they could write their own story, right? They had slates, they had proverbs or scriptures or something, and they would just copy for a couple years. And in doing so, what happens? Well, it builds up stamina and patterns of language. Stamina is pretty important. Have you ever met a child who writes a sentence and is just so exhausted they have to take a long break, fall in the chair, get up from the chair, get a drink, get something to eat, use the restroom, go outside, jump on the trampoline? It's been 45 minutes and you've got only one sentence, and for a homeschooling mom in particular, that's pretty important. In schools, the kids can't do all that stuff. So there's a certain advantage of, okay, we got you now. But it can be a case where just doing a little bit of copywork every day, it builds the muscular structures, the neurological, the hand-eye connections, that stuff that's not going to develop if you don't do it. And I will say that I think it's very sad that most modern schools today frown on copywork because it looks like the enemy of creativity. So, let's just take all our 7-year-olds, give them paper, and cheerlead them into writing something, and then tell them that whatever they did is good. Well, this fails miserably. For one, they're not imitating, so they're just going to do whatever they can do, but they can't get better. And number two, it's disingenuous. Because if a kid does whatever he can do, and you say, oh, that's so good, that's wonderful, well, that's a lie. It's not good, right? And the child knows it's not good because he's got enough exposure to the world of good language to know that that isn't that. So sadly, I think that we have really gone backwards here. And we see almost in schools that we push this be creative, be unique, be original, express yourself in the early grades. And then as the kids get older, we shrink that and say, no, you got to do this in this way, and this essay, and this report, and it all has to be like this. So we almost opposite. If we were to spend more time teaching the basic skills through a stricter form of imitation and practice, then as the kids get older, they would have basic skills upon which they could build more creativity. Fortunately, we know from working with kids of all ages is that a little bit goes a long ways. So copywork builds stamina, patterns of language, and it creates confidence. And so I would suggest that if you are teaching in a school, or you are homeschooling, or you are tutoring young children, say up through the age of 8 or 9, simple copywork would be of huge benefit. And even a little bit, 10 minutes a day, will go a long ways to build stamina, confidence, and a willingness to just do it, right? It's like running or doing exercise, right? If someone says, well, you got to go run a 5K race, right? Well, if you haven't done that in a while or ever, you'd better not. You might die. Right? So what would you do? You run a little bit, recover, run a little bit longer the next day, recover, and build yourself up over time. And then anyone in this room could run 5 kilometers if they did it the right way. And it's, writing on paper is the same thing. Okay, in 1990, Myra Linden and Arthur Wimby wrote this book called Why Johnny Can't Write. I believe Myra Linden was a president or past president of the National Council of Teachers of English. So She has some creds. And they wrote this book, which I guess was part of the Why Johnny Can't Do Anything Anymore series, right? I mean, there was Why Johnny Can't Read, and Why Johnny Still Can't Read, and Why Johnny Can't Do Math, and all that. I don't know why they're picking on Johnny. There were Sallys that had the same issues, I'm sure. But nevertheless, 1990, this book. And in this book, they cited primary research demonstrating that the writing skills of high school graduates had been in continuous decline for 20 years. 20 years. Carnegie Foundation research, all that. Okay, so that means if we add 32 plus 20, 50 years of continuous decline. Because I don't know anyone who's going to argue things are better now than they were in 1990. Do you? No, so everything got worse. So 50 years of continuous decline. Why? So in this book, the authors outline the two best and the two worst ways to teach writing. And that's the bulk of the book. So according to them, the two best ways to teach writing are, number one, text reconstruction, which, if you are familiar with our idea of keyword outlines and writing from keyword outlines, you would recognize that immediately. And the other is sentence combining. So you give kids two clauses and show them how to put those two phrases or clauses into a sentence, or take two sentences and make a longer, more complex sentence. So they basically kind of created a curriculum. I don't think it went very far. I don't believe it's available anymore. But they kind of created a writing curriculum based on these two ideas. We, of course, can see them. We've got keyword outlines, retelling content, and, of course, text sentence combining is kind of like our dress-ups and openers. It's like the style techniques, only probably even more effective in terms of cultivating variety than she had in that book. All right, so those are, according to them, the two best. What, according to them, are the two worst? Well, the first, next to worst way is an over-reliance on grammar. So there was a period there where you always had grammar and composition, right? And they were always one book. It was grammar and composition. It was all together. And most of it was fairly technical grammatical analysis. And what they found was that you can teach grammar till it's coming out your ears, but it doesn't necessarily mean you will write well or use that grammar. And I do have a different talk called But What About Grammar? And so I talk about the three divisions of grammar. The first and most important being inherent grammar, or inherited. That's what you get from being read to out loud a lot and what you get from memorizing language. And it's not analytical. In fact, you can write pretty well and have no idea how you do it, right? There are people who write very well and probably could not name all the parts of speech or parse a sentence. Why? Because they had that rich inherent grammar through one or more sources of input. Second form of grammar would be applied grammar. This is what they test on things like the SAT and the ACT. They'll give you a sentence, and then there's a missing piece, and then they'll give you 4 or 5 options and say which one fits in best, right? And you could do this by parsing the sentence and evaluating and analyzing. You could also do it by just looking at it and kind of knowing, because of your inherent grammar, which was going to be the best. And that's why kids who have high levels of exposure to literature will almost effortlessly score better on language portions of standardized tests that do that. All right? So the SAT and the ACT don't ask you to label parts of speech. They ask you to figure out, in whatever way you can, which are the best ways to use language. Then, of course, you have analytical grammar, which is what are all those things called and what are the rules that govern their behavior. So if you want to unpack that more, but what about grammar? But what they did find is that teaching a whole lot of analytical grammar did not significantly improve writing skills. So this over-reliance on grammar. And of course, the number one worst way to teach writing is free writing, which came in with the explosion of emphasis on creativity And it was kind of the idea. If you just write and write and write as much as you can, you'll just learn to do it. Kind of osmosis, right? So very interesting book in this way. For me, I found it was kind of confirming what I had observed in my own experience. And of course, it's pretty good advertisement for what we do. Text reconstruction. Now, this is interesting. Some of you probably have watched our seminar, Teaching Writing Structure and Style, and some of you may have watched it a very long time ago. And so you would know that I used in that a particular excerpt from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. So when I read Myra Linda and Arthur Wemby's book, Why Johnny Can't Write, I was delighted to see that they used the same excerpt as I had used in explaining what this is. There are also other writers who have trained themselves through text reconstruction. How does it work? Well, you transfer keywords into an outline format, right? So you read a sentence, choose a limited number, and in our system we say 3 keywords, and you just transfer those keywords. We're going to do this in a minute, so don't worry. You'll see exactly how it works, into an outline. So you're taking hints of the meaning of the sentence, moving them from the text into an outline. And then you would continue until you have done all the sentences. And then you would verbally retell those ideas from the keywords. And then, lastly, you would write those ideas from the keywords, representing, if you will, that same idea. And in the process, you can learn some of the conventions, some of the technicalities of capital letters and periods and commas and apostrophes and all that stuff. So you've got stuff to practice with to learn the conventions for writing. And it's not a new idea. So for those of you who are familiar, this is review. For those of you who haven't seen it before, I found it pretty exciting. When my father happened to find my papers, he took occasion to talk to me about the manner of my writing and observed that although I had the advantage of my antagonist's incorrect spelling and pointing, which I owed to the printing house, I fell far short in elegance of expression and method and in perspicuity, of which he convinced me by several instances. I saw the justice of his remarks and thence grew more attentive to the manner in writing and determined to endeavor at improvement. Wouldn't it be great if all kids were just like that? Although I think Franklin was kind of older when he had this experience. But about this time, I met with an odd volume of The Spectator. It was the 3rd. I had never before seen any of them. I bought it, read it over, and was much delighted with it. I thought the writing excellent and wished, if possible, to imitate it. With this view, I took some of the papers and, making short hints of the sentiment in each sentence, laid them by a few days, and then, without looking at the book, tried to complete the papers again by expressing each hinted sentiment at length and as fully as it had been expressed before in any suitable words that should come to hand. So that's it, right? He had the original, he took keywords, he put the original away, he tried to reconstruct the ideas. So this is the primary form of where we start with imitation in writing. And if you want to see our whole pathway, we have, of course, this full course, Teaching Writing Structure and Style, as well as the Structure and Style for Students, where we go through. We start there with everybody, whether they're 7 years old or 17 years old or 70 years old. We start at the same place with everyone with this text reconstruction idea. But let's try one together. Here's a commonly known fable. I really like working with Aesop fables for a few reasons. Number one, they're readily available and they come in all different levels of complexity when it comes to vocabulary. They're easy to rewrite. Nobody owns them, so you can't get accused of plagiarizing an Aesop fable. And they have usually a narrative that sticks in the memory and makes it easier to deal with. And they have universal appeal. Nobody complains about Aesop fables. You can do it with 2nd graders, you can do it with 10th graders. Nobody complains. All right, so we have a short little one here. One day, a hare was making fun of a tortoise for being so slow upon his feet. The tortoise, annoyed with this teasing, offered to run a race with the hare. The hare laughed and said it would be no contest, but he agreed to race anyway. It was decided that the fox should set the course and be the judge. Although they started at the same time, the hare was soon so far ahead that he thought he might as well have a rest, so he lay down and fell fast asleep. Meanwhile, the tortoise kept plodding on and in time reached the finish line. The hare awoke with a start and ran to the finish, only to find that the tortoise had already won the race. All right, you've heard that before. Almost all the kids I meet have heard this story in some version. Shorter, same, longer, different, but it's familiar. So that's convenient. And if I meet kids who haven't heard this, well, they need to. So I'm glad I was there with it. Now, how do we do this keyword outline business? Well, we just use a piece of paper. We're going to take 3 words from each sentence. The title is free, hare and the tortoise. And so then we go back and we read the first sentence. One day a hare was making fun of a tortoise for being so slow on his feet. What are the key words? Well, most kids are going to, probably say hare, right? Because that is a key word, that's the subject of the sentence. But then you can point out, well, that's in the title. You're not likely to forget that. So what would you choose if you didn't need to remember that? Because you'll probably remember. And you usually get down to something like making fun and slow. Okay, so, and there's no right way to do this. You could come up with something slightly different, but you choose them, and then you can transfer them into a keyword outline. We recommend putting commas between the keywords, and then that carries on into note-taking skills later on, so you don't end up writing a bunch of things you don't really need, and keeping it concise. Okay, next sentence. The tortoise, annoyed with this teasing, offered to run a race with the hare. So you boil that down. Key words. Some people might say teasing. Some people might say run. That's okay. There's no absolutely right or wrong way to go. But if you were to choose annoyed, offered, and race and transfer them into the keyword outline, it would look something like that. Next sentence. The hare laughed and said it would be no contest, but he agreed to race anyway. Again, some kids might say anyway, and other kids might say race. Well, you just had race. You don't need that again. You're probably not going to forget you're in a race. So you get it down to laughed, contest, agreed, no contest. You might put a no smoking symbol on top of the contest. And if kids are going to forget who's doing what, you could put the initial, that's free. So we stick with 3 keywords, but symbols, initials, abbreviations, numbers are free. And we could, of course, keep going with that. So this is kind of a basic form of imitation, and it would be unit 1 and 2 of our 9 units of the structure and style system. Now, unfortunately, some people get stuck right there, and they learn how to do this, and they teach it to a bunch of kids, and it works pretty well, and then after a few months, everybody's bored, right? Plus, you've got people worried, well, oh no, what if you have to write something and you don't have a source text? What if you really do have to write from your memory or imagination or something you know about? Or what do you do if you have to write a long essay? Okay, we can solve this problem. So we proceed into increasingly challenging but still readily accessible forms of imitation by using models. So rather than text reconstruction, where we're working really with sentence by sentence, now we're looking at models. Stories. Have you ever had this experience? You have a child, a student, and they want to write a story. They're all excited. So they start writing a story, and they write for a while, page 2, 3, 10, whatever. And then they read the story and feel, this is not as good as I had hoped it would be. I mean, maybe you've had that experience. I avoid writing stories because I hate that feeling, right? And what happened? Well, you were trying to write a story, but you didn't have a clear concept of what would make the story work. And so in our Unit 3, we have retelling narrative stories by saying, okay, any story you give me, whether it's an Aesop fable or the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy, you can identify 3 parts to that story: the characters and setting, the basic problem, and then the resolution and outcome. And so you can take a story of any length and retell it in 3 parts, and you're pretty much guaranteed to get a story that at least works, at least better than it would if you didn't have a model. Now, in our system, we like to move into academic writing as well, because, some people are going to grow up and write stories, but most people are going to have to grow up and write things like reports and emails and summaries and stuff like that. So how do you do that? Well, again, modeling and imitation. If you say to a child, well, write a paragraph, if it's a awake child with half a brain, they'd probably say, what's a paragraph? Right? That's a reasonable question. Now you have to figure out how to explain that to someone. Well, you could try to explain it, or you could show them. Remember that whole thing, don't tell, show? And so how do you show? Well, we have in Unit 4 this idea of a paragraph that has a topic sentence, a certain number of details, and a clincher sentence that repeats or reflects 2 to 3 keywords from the topic. This is a model. You can do that. Right? And then, as a teacher, you're going to help refine things. In our system later on, we do more in terms of refining the internals of the paragraph. But like anything, if you want to teach it, start simple and clear, and then add layers to that gradually as it becomes mastered. So in Unit 4, we teach children how to summarize a reference by choosing from too many facts the ones that are important, interesting, or relevant, and then organizing it into topic-based paragraphs. And we show this with posters, we show it with actual compositions, we show it by writing on the board together with children. Lots of ways to do it. Writing from pictures is our Unit 5, and now we're really forcing the children to move from text-based, here was the article, here was the story, here's the content, into imagination. But we don't just say make up everything. Here's a set of pictures, and again, a model for thinking about those pictures. And we could get into it in a lot more detail, but suffice it to say that thinking is getting stuff out of your brain. You won't get something out that isn't in there to begin with, so you got to find it. How do you get stuff out of your brain? I always tease the teenagers. If you want to get stuff out of your brain, you just imitate your mom, because she knows how to get stuff out of your brain, right? What does she do? She asks you questions. Where have you been? Who else was there? What have you been doing all this time? Why are you late? And how are you going to clean this up, right? Your mom becomes a master question asker. So the trick of learning to think better is to learn how to become a master question asker to yourself. And that extends very far out into all sorts of tools for thinking. And I always point out to kids, really, the quality of your life will depend on the quality of the questions that you ask yourself. But we start with, basic who, what, where, why, when, how, what happened before, what might happen after, is there anything invisible, what's outside the picture, right? And get some practical, basic information questions. And they can write from pictures. Now, some kids have an easier time with this than others. I have personally a hard time with this creative business, but I have got better. Why? Because I have a model that includes a target length and a system for thinking. Then in Unit 6, we're back on the report research side, and this would be how to use too much information from multiple sources. So kind of like that great research project that you might have done with note cards decades ago in microcosm. And then we do in Unit 7 talk about inventive writing. So here's the thing. Write about your dog. Write about your vacation. Write about aliens from the planet Zug. Write about anything you want. Right? Well, how do you access all that information? Again, it's about the questions. It's about process. And, you go into any school and they'll have a kind of writing process. Have you seen these posters? They're kind of useless, but it'll say, something like brainstorm, right? Gather your ideas. Pre-write, that's what they call it, pre-writing. gather your ideas. And they'll say draft, sloppy copy, right? And they'll say revise, edit your work, improve, and then publish. And, for kids, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not specific enough to give them tools to be able to really do that. So we take that and give it more specific, detailed steps in between. And we do it in Unit 7, where you've got a whole runway of basic skills development through stories and reports and writing from pictures and all that. But a lot of writing programs will kind of start here with this, and then some kids survive, other kids don't do so well. We also finish up with Unit 8 and 9, which is the essay models. We have the basic 5-paragraph essay model, which some people don't like. You may have a child go off to college and the teacher will say, if you do a 5-paragraph essay in this class, it's an automatic F. I hate it. I don't want to see it. Well, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing to have learned. It just means it's a bad thing to do in that class. But, my argument would be, well, okay, if you do learn how to write a 5-paragraph essay, then you could have variations on that. Go for 6, go for 7, go for 10, go for 12, go for 9. But at least you've got something you can build on. And again, it's connected with imitation. Whereas if you say, no, never learn that, it's bad, well, what are you going to teach, right? And then Unit 9 is our critique, which would kind of replace the book report business, where we take that story sequence chart and then add in the background information and what the writer thinks about that. So these are 9 units, and we have extensions off of this up to a pretty high level. Literary analysis, essays, super essays of 12 to 16 paragraphs or more. So our extensions off this are effective in the larger academic world, but we start everybody and be sure there's a foundation, right? So, you don't teach people to do tricks until you teach them the basic way to ride the bike or stay on the skateboard or whatever. Okay, so those are our models. Now, stylistic imitation is where we're not just using imitation of ideas and structures to build our skills, but we're actually now looking at the way people use words to communicate those ideas. And we know that we constantly, all of us, adjust the way we use words for our audience, right? So if you are teaching a group of 6-year-old children, you speak to them differently than if you were teaching a group of high school kids, right? I talk to grandchildren differently than I talk to my wife. I don't even have to think about that. It just happens, right? So I would talk to homeschool parents, maybe using different vocabulary than I would if I were in a school doing in-service or professional development for teachers. I would use different words, different expressions, different ways of combining those words and expressions. Okay, so how can we teach this to children? Well, we have our stylistic techniques that are kind of foundational, but this idea, I really, really love this idea. And so I wanted to share it with you because we are going to run out of time here. I just stumbled into this, and it's one of the favorite things I ever discovered. So many years ago, I did a talk called Power Tips for Planning and Writing a College-Level Paper. This is a 2-hour talk, and I recorded it, we sold it for a while. It should have been called How to Spy on Your Professor and Figure Out His Writing Style so you can imitate that and get a better grade on every paper when you go to college, right? Because that's what the whole talk was about. And the idea would be to take a piece of writing from one of your teachers, right? And then figure out what they're doing. Now, if you've learned our dress-up techniques, you could actually count, okay, how many ly adverbs per 100 words? Some people would use more, some people would be very sparse, some people might not use them at all. How many adjectives per 100 words? What's the average length of sentence? How many prepositional phrases per 100 words? How does this professor start their sentences? Do they ever do things that some people like and other people don't like, such as starting a sentence with the word because? right? Some people would be very allergic to that, and other people wouldn't bother them at all. So once you have kind of developed a repertoire of stylistic awareness, then you can pick and choose according to what you're trying to imitate. And so here's the thing. You could write your paper, figure out what that one professor likes. If they do this, you do it. If they don't do it, don't do it. If they rarely do it a little bit. If they do it a lot, do it a lot. You can actually make yourself sound like someone else by consciously imitating their style. Then, of course, the professor is going to read your paper and say, wow, this is pretty good. Sounds just like me. I mean, they won't think that consciously, but that's the impression. And we're all that we're all going to be like that, human nature. And then you got a different professor who may have a very different style, right? You can analyze, if you can find something they wrote, you can analyze it and imitate it. And I know this works because it was a college professor who told me how to do this, right? And just as a side comment here, it's very interesting how subjective the grading of writing can be. A group of students at the University of British Columbia many years ago had one paper, and they gave it to about a dozen different teachers at the university, professors, and asked them to mark the paper. And the grades ranged from A- to C+ on the same paper, thereby demonstrating how subjective that was in terms of, did the professor like it? Now, obviously, there's content that they may or may not like, but a lot of it has to do with personal preference and style. So I had taught this for a while, and then I had a group of students, high school kids. I thought, I would love to teach them how to do this, but there's a few problems. They're all homeschooled, so they don't have any professors to spy on. Secondly, professors are going to be different, but more similar than different, usually. What we need to do is start with two things that are very different to learn this skill. So I got this idea of taking three very different authors. And I think one of them was Charles Dickens. So I got the first page of A Christmas Carol. And then another one I got was Hans Christian Andersen. I took the first page of Little Mermaid. And those are right there. That's very different if you look at them. And then I took the third one was James Finn Garner wrote a series of books called Politically Correct Bedtime Stories, Politically Correct Fairy Tales. I don't know if you ever saw that, but it was kind of, it was a satire of poking fun at overreaching political correctness back in the 90s. So instead of a fairy tale with a dwarf, you had, a height handicapped individual or, whatever. So I gave him these three, and I said, okay, let's figure out what makes Dickens sound like Dickens, what makes Anderson sound like Anderson, or maybe I used Twain, can't remember, and what makes Jameson Garner sound like Jameson Garner. We made a list. Then I said, okay, homework is take this Aesop fable and rewrite it in the style of these three authors. They had so much fun with this. I couldn't believe it. It was an off-checklist assignment because you're not worrying about dress-ups and openers when you're trying to imitate. And they really got into this and had a lot of fun. And then I tried it again with different authors. I think I did Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, and the King James Version of the Bible, and something else. And I tried that. And I've tried this many times with many groups of kids. And I've found they always enjoy it. They always learn something from trying to imitate an author. And I also came to realize that if they're whining or complaining and you make them imitate the author, they suddenly have a much greater appreciation. Remember one time I was teaching Jane Eyre, right? I don't know if you've ever tried to teach the book Jane Eyre to a bunch of high school students who don't care. And they're just, this is so dumb, and this is hard, and nobody really talks like that, and this is stupid, right? Well, you don't know if people didn't used to talk like this. Maybe they did. But nevertheless, here's your challenge. I want you to take a scene from a movie that you know really well, because all kids have their movie, like they've watched 10 times, like Princess Bride or whatever. Take a scene from a movie and rewrite it in the style of Bronte. See if you can do what she did. Never teach this book. Tale of Two Cities. Makes absolutely no sense. Right? You read the first third of it, you're like, I have no clue what's going on. I don't understand most of these words. This would never get published today. But anyway, it's there. So they're whining and complaining. He spent 2 pages just describing a stupid hallway. Yeah, he did. All right, here's your homework. Find a spot in your house and see if you can spin it out for 2 pages and sound like Dickens doing it. It changed their whole perspective. So anyway, I really love this idea. And so I had them analyze and then imitate what makes Dickens sound like Dickens, and then rewrite the fable. Okay, now, I had one kid, he took to this so well that he used a different author on his own time, it wasn't even an assignment, to play with this. And so this is kind of like the epitome of this thing that I have ever seen a student produce. And I have seen dozens of excellent examples, but this one got me. The race. Once upon a day quite cheerful, there was no soul one bit tearful, save a weak but not quite weary little terrapin of yore. For he had received an earful from a rabbit who was fearful that his record of great running had become forgotten lore, a memory and nothing more. Do you recognize that? Yes. Hence the tortoise challenged rabbit for a race to show his habit of great running and to save it in the books forevermore. The rabbit instantly agreed to this chance to show his speed to the terribly naive turtle of quite famous lore, remembered now forevermore. I mean, he got it right down to the meter and the internal rhyme scheme. I mean, brilliant, brilliant. I think he was 16 when he did it. So, you're looking at basically a very mature, competent adult. But I have tried this again and again and again, and I find that everyone kind of enjoys it and learns something. So the value of author imitation. So I was at a conference once, and this young woman walked up to me, and she said, she didn't know anything about me, right? She's like, excellence in writing. I'm standing there in a suit. And she told me that she wants to become a writer, and she's just starting her university years, and she's going to hopefully get an MFA in creative writing down the line. That's what she wants. That's her goal. So she asked me, what is my advice? So I said, well, I don't want to do this, but if I did want to do what you want to do, I would make a list of my 10 favorite authors. I would take the first author on that list and I would try to write stuff until I could sound just like that author. Then I would go to the next author on the list and try to write stuff until I could sound just like that author. And I would go through until I could imitate my 10 favorite authors, thereby building up a repertoire of ways to do things. And she looked at me almost in disbelief and said to me, well, that is the exact opposite of what they have always told me in my classes at school, which is never imitate anyone. And so there you see it. But I will argue and finish up here and say that by practicing with models and systems for thinking and imitating great stuff and understanding how everybody else has used words to accomplish goals, we will build our repertoire and be able to do it. Here's 3 last quotes for you. Burke, way back in 1756. It is by imitation far more than by precept that we learn everything. Do you get that? Precept is when I explain to you how to do stuff. Imitation is when I show you how to do stuff, right? It is by imitation far more than by precept that we learn everything, and what we learn thus, we acquire not only more effectually, but more pleasantly. I found that to be true. I do not know who this person is, Edward Bulwer Lytton. Someone may know. I know a lot of quotes from people. I don't know who they are, but imitation, if noble and general, ensures the best hope of originality. Why? Because you gain that great repertoire of tools, of things to do. Imitation is not just the sincerest form of flattery, it is the sincerest form of learning. From George Bernard Shaw, who himself was kind of pushing on the modern side, but he understood that. All right, well, that's a little bit. I'm sure we could unpack many of those ideas in greater detail, but that should get you started thinking about, okay, if I want to improve my writing or improve my teaching of writing, how do I use imitation to do so? Thank you.